Water doesn't announce when it's turned dangerous. That's the thing nobody outside this business ever quite understands. A reservoir can look exactly the way it looked yesterday, same color, same surface, same gentle current moving toward the intake, while carrying something in it that could put 400 people in a hospital within 48 hours. You learn to test for what you can't see. You learn, eventually, that the things you can't see are the only things that ever actually matter. My name is Margo Okafor. Everyone at the Delridge water treatment plant calls me Margo. I've been a licensed water treatment operator for 29 years, the last 14 of them as chief plant operator, responsible for the drinking water of a city of 60,000 people who have never once had to think about where their water comes from, which is, frankly, the entire point of doing this job well. Nobody thanks you for the crisis that never happened. This is a story about a crisis I almost let happen, not because I doubted a system, but because the man running my plant's new automation contract cared more about a quarterly earnings call than he cared about what was building in our reservoir that summer. Delridge's water treatment infrastructure was, by 2024, genuinely old, original chlorination equipment from the 1970s, a coagulation and filtration system patched together across 5 decades of budget cycles, and a city council that had spent 15 years underfunding capital improvements while the population grew around it. When a private infrastructure firm called Meridian Aquatech offered to install a fully automated chemical dosing and water quality monitoring system, at no upfront cost to the city, in exchange for a 20-year operations contract, the council approved it in a single meeting. The system was called AquaSense. It managed coagulant dosing, chlorine residual levels, and pH balance across the entire treatment train in real time, cross-referencing turbidity sensors, flow rate, and a dozen other inputs to optimize chemical usage down to the gallon. It was, on the level it was designed to operate, a genuine improvement. Delridge's chemical costs dropped 19% in the first year, and water quality compliance reports, on every metric AquaSense was built to track, came back clean. The man running Meridian Aquatech's contract on site was named Dennis Farrow, 44 years old, regional operations director, a man who talked about water as a service delivery platform in a tone that made my back teeth hurt the first time I heard it. I want to be careful here, because in the first 2 stories I might have told you about people in my life, I'd have looked for the sympathetic version of Dennis, the man who genuinely believed in his system, caught in an impossible set of financial pressures he didn't fully choose. I looked for that version of Dennis for the better part of a year. I want to tell you honestly that I never found it. AquaSense doesn't need a manual toxin screen every week, Margo, he told me, the first time I raised it, standing in the plant's control room with a laptop bag over his shoulder like he had somewhere more important to be. It's not in the contract's monitoring schedule. The turbidity and chlorine sensors would catch any bloom event long before it became a public health issue. Turbidity doesn't measure cyanotoxins, Dennis. Neither does chlorine residual. You can have crystal clear water sitting on top of an algal bloom releasing microcystin into the intake, and every sensor on this system will read completely normal. Then we're relying on a hazard that hasn't happened at this reservoir in the 11 years of data Meridian reviewed before bidding this contract. 11 years of data from a reservoir that didn't have the nutrient runoff problem it has today, because upstream agricultural expansion has tripled phosphorus loading in the last 5 years. The data you reviewed doesn't reflect the reservoir we actually have anymore. He didn't have an answer for that, not really, and I want to be precise about what happened next, because it's the part of this story that separates it from an honest disagreement between 2 people who see risk differently. Dennis didn't argue the science with me again after that conversation. He simply stopped scheduling the manual algal toxin screening that Delridge's own state-certified lab technician, a woman named Yolanda Reyes, had been running weekly for 6 years before AquaSense arrived, cutting it from the maintenance budget as a redundant legacy protocol, in a line-item memo I only found by accident, 8 months later, buried in a budget review I wasn't technically authorized to have full access to anymore, since AquaSense's contract had quietly shifted operational budget authority from my office to Meridian's regional headquarters. I want to explain how that authority shift happened, because I think it matters more than a single villain's decision, and because I've turned it over enough times since to understand my own share of the blame in not catching it sooner. When the City Council approved the Meridian contract, the language transferring day-to-day operational budget authority to Meridian's regional office was presented. In the council meeting minutes I later reviewed, as a routine efficiency measure, standard practice, the council was told, for infrastructure partnerships of this kind, allowing the contractor to manage maintenance scheduling without requiring a city council vote for every line item. I sat through part of that meeting myself, distracted by a filtration equipment failure that same week, and I didn't read the full amendment closely enough to understand what it actually meant until the toxin screening was already gone. 14 years of being the person everyone trusted to catch exactly this kind of detail, and I missed it in the one contract that mattered most. Yolanda noticed the screening had stopped before I did. She mentioned it to me casually, in April, assuming I'd already known and approved the change, and I remember the specific, sinking feeling of realizing I hadn't. By the time I tracked down the actual memo authorizing the cut, and understood exactly why it had been made, the reservoir's phosphorus loading from 3 consecutive wet springs of upstream agricultural runoff had already set the summer I'm about to describe into motion, whether anyone had caught the missing screening or not. The summer this story turns on was unusually hot, even for a region used to hot summers, with 3 consecutive weeks in July where daytime temperatures sat above 95 degrees and the reservoir's surface temperature climbed into a range that, combined with the phosphorus runoff I'd flagged the previous year, created close to ideal conditions for a cyanobacteria bloom. I'd watched the upstream agricultural expansion happen gradually over 5 years, new fields cleared along the tributary that fed our reservoir, and I'd written 2 separate memos to the city's planning commission flagging the runoff risk, memos that had gone, as far as I could tell, entirely unread by anyone with the authority to slow that expansion down. I noticed the water's color shift on a Tuesday morning in late July, walking the reservoir shoreline the way I have most mornings for 29 years, coffee in hand, before the plant's day shift even started, a faint blue-green tint along the northern shore, subtle enough that most people walking past would never have registered it as anything but algae doing what algae does in summer. I'd seen that particular shade of blue-green exactly twice before in 29 years, both times preceding confirmed cyanotoxin blooms that required emergency treatment protocol changes, and both memories came back to me standing on that shoreline with a clarity that felt almost physical, the way a smell can put you back in a room you haven't stood in for years. I requested an emergency manual toxin screen that same day. Yolanda ran it herself, using test kits she'd kept in her own lab supply closet out of what she later told me was a private, unspoken worry that had been building in her for months without either of us saying it out loud to each other. She told me, months afterward, that she'd started quietly restocking her own testing supplies out of pocket the same week she'd realized the official screening protocol had been cut, not because she'd expected this exact summer, but because some part of her hadn't been willing to fully trust that the gap wouldn't eventually matter. The results came back showing microcystin concentrations at 1.8 micrograms per liter, nearly twice the EPA's recreational exposure guideline, and rising, in a reservoir that fed drinking water directly to 60,000 people, through a treatment system whose automated monitoring had, throughout the entire event, continued reporting clean turbidity and normal chlorine residual, exactly as I'd warned it would 11 months earlier. I brought the results to Dennis within the hour, standing in his temporary site office with Yolanda's lab printout in my hand, my own hands not quite steady in a way I noticed and tried to ignore. AquaSense turbidity readings are clean across the board, he said, barely glancing at the paper before setting it down on his desk without picking it back up. If there were a toxin event at this level, we'd be seeing it reflected somewhere in the system. You're not seeing it because the system was never built to see it, Dennis. That's not a flaw in your engineering. It's a gap in your monitoring scope, and I flagged that gap 11 months ago, in writing, before you cut the weekly screening that would have caught this building 3 weeks earlier than it did. I'm not authorizing an emergency treatment protocol change based on one field test from a kit that isn't part of our certified monitoring chain, Margo. That's not how this contract's compliance reporting works. Then get me a certified lab confirmation today, Dennis. Not next week. Today. Because if this reading's accurate, and I believe it is, every hour we wait is an hour closer to something neither of us wants attached to our names. He didn't answer that directly. He told me he'd escalate it appropriately, a phrase I'd hear from him and from Meridian's corporate office enough times over the following 72 hours that it eventually stopped sounding like a commitment and started sounding like exactly what it was, a way of sounding responsive while doing nothing at all. I understood, standing in that office, exactly what Dennis was actually protecting, and it wasn't a scientific position. Meridian Aquatech was 11 weeks from a mid-contract performance review that would determine whether the company secured 2 additional 20-year contracts with neighboring municipalities, contracts worth, by public bid documents I later obtained, north of $80 million combined. A confirmed toxin event at Delridge, requiring an emergency treatment protocol AquaSense monitoring scope had failed to catch, was precisely the kind of story that could end those bids before they were ever awarded. I didn't have unilateral authority to change the treatment protocol myself. 14 years as chief operator, and the AquaSense contract had quietly restructured operational sign-off so that any deviation from the automated system standard treatment train required Meridian's regional approval, a detail buried in a contract amendment the City Council had approved 18 months earlier without, I suspect, fully understanding what authority they were signing away. I went over Dennis's head, calling Meridian's corporate compliance office directly, and reached a woman named Patricia Lynn, a compliance officer 3 states away who listened to my report for 4 minutes before telling me she'd need to loop in the regional director for the affected contract, before taking any action, which meant, in practice, looping in Dennis himself. I called the State Department of Environmental Health the same afternoon, a call I'd never once had to make in 29 years, and reported the microcystin reading directly to a state water quality inspector named Robert Osei, along with Yolanda's full lab documentation and the 11-month-old memo showing when and why the weekly screening protocol had been discontinued. Dennis found out about that call within hours, and the conversation that followed was the only time in this entire story that he stopped performing calm corporate reasonableness and let something closer to the truth show through. "You just handed the state a paper trail that makes this look like Meridian deliberately created a public health risk to protect a bid pipeline," he said, in the parking lot outside the plant, his voice low and furious in a way it hadn't been in any of our previous conversations. "You did create the risk, Dennis. I just stopped being the only person who knew about it." Inspector Osei arrived at Delridge the following morning with 2 colleagues from the state lab, running an independent toxin analysis that confirmed Yolanda's field results within a margin that left no room for Meridian's compliance team to dispute the finding as a testing error. Microcystin concentrations had climbed to 2.4 micrograms per liter by the time the state's own sample was drawn, 26 hours after my initial report, and rising fast enough that Osei's team classified the situation as an active public health threat requiring immediate emergency treatment intervention. The emergency protocol, which I implemented that afternoon under direct state authority that superseded Meridian's contractual sign-off requirement entirely, involved switching the coagulation process to a powdered activated carbon treatment specifically effective against cyanotoxins. A protocol AquaSense automated dosing system wasn't configured to run at all, requiring Yolanda and me to operate that portion of the treatment train manually, in 12-hour shifts, for the better part of 9 days, the way water treatment had been done for decades before any of this automation existed. Delridge's drinking water never exceeded safe consumption thresholds at the tap, throughout the entire event, a fact I want to state clearly, because I know how a story like this can sound in the retelling, and the truth is that the emergency protocol worked exactly the way it was designed to work, catching the problem at the reservoir intake before it ever reached a single household's faucet. 60,000 people drank safe water every single day of that summer, including the 9 days it took to manually treat a threat an automated system had been actively prevented from ever detecting. That distinction mattered enormously to the outcome that followed, because it meant this wasn't a story about a city that got poisoned. It was a story about exactly how close a city came to being poisoned, and precisely whose decision had made that closeness possible. The state's investigation into Meridian Aquatech's decision to discontinue Delridge's weekly toxin screening took 4 months. Inspector Osei's final report was unambiguous. Meridian had eliminated a documented, previously functioning public health safeguard, over the explicit written objection of the plant's chief operator, primarily to reduce operational costs ahead of a contract performance review tied to future bid opportunities. The report used the phrase, reckless disregard for foreseeable public health risk, language that made its way, within days, into local news coverage that Meridian's corporate communications team never managed to get ahead of. The City Council terminated Meridian's 20-year contract within 6 weeks of the report's release, a termination clause that existed specifically for cases of documented public health negligence, a clause, I later learned, that the Council's own attorney had insisted on including during contract negotiations, over Meridian's objection, in a decision that turned out to matter more than anyone at that negotiating table could have known at the time. Meridian's bids for the 2 neighboring municipal contracts were withdrawn before either city's council ever voted on them. The $80 million pipeline Dennis had been protecting evaporating within the same quarter he'd been trying to protect it through. Dennis Farrow was terminated by Meridian roughly 2 months after the council's decision, not, I suspect, out of any genuine accountability on the company's part, but because a scapegoat was operationally useful once the story had become too public to manage quietly. I don't know where he works now. I didn't ask, when Patricia Lynn called me, months later, in what I understood to be an attempt to salvage some future relationship between Meridian and Delridge that the city council had already made clear was not going to happen. Delridge rebuilt its water treatment automation the following year, using a different contractor, under a new city ordinance, one I helped draft, alongside the council's attorney, that made manual public health screening protocols a matter of municipal code rather than a line item any private contractor could quietly remove from a budget. AquaSense underlying monitoring technology wasn't the problem, and the new system we installed uses a similar automated dosing architecture, refined now to include the toxin monitoring gap that started this entire story, built in from day one instead of fought for after the fact. Yolanda still runs the weekly manual toxin screen herself, the same test kits, the same lab bench she's worked at for 7 years now. I still walk the reservoir shoreline most mornings, the way I have for 29 years, watching for a particular shade of blue-green that most people would never notice, because the plant's newest automated sensors, however good they've become, still can't read a color that means something only to someone who's spent 3 decades learning exactly what it's telling her. I think about Dennis sometimes, not with anger anymore, mostly with a kind of tired clarity about what actually happened that summer. He never doubted that automation could manage a water system well. Neither did I, in the end. The system we rebuilt afterward proves that much. What he doubted, or more precisely, what he decided not to let matter, was whether a gap in what a system could see was worth the cost of closing it, when the alternative was a number on a quarterly report that looked better without the expense. Water has never cared about a quarterly report. It's never cared about a bid pipeline, or a performance review, or which line item survived a budget meeting. It only ever cared whether someone was still watching the color of the shoreline closely enough to notice, the one morning a year it actually mattered, before the sensors that couldn't see it ever had the chance to lie by omission on somebody's behalf.